This is Unit 3, Part 2. In the previous video, we started looking at the brain and we covered the cerebrum. And in this video, we'll look at the diencephalon, the brain stem, the cerebellum, and also the spinal cord, the other part of the central nervous system besides the brain. These brain and the spinal cord, of course, make up the central nervous system. So, as I was saying, these are the different parts of the brain, and with the spinal cord together, these form the central nervous system. The diencephalon is made up of three parts: the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. In the brain, it surrounds, this area is all around the third ventricle, a fluid-filled space, cerebral spinal fluid-filled space. We'll also look at the brain stem, which has three parts: the midbrain, pons, and medulla, and then go on to the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and how the central nervous system is protected. Okay, so the diencephalon is found in this area here. I think I'll change color. In this area here, it is made up of three parts: the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. And it surrounds a fluid-filled area called the third ventricle. Now there are different functions, and this is really a very basic, only introductory description of those functions for the different areas. And I'm trying to stay to the major ones, or the most relevant ones. So let's move ahead. In the brain, the thalamus acts as a central receiving hub for all incoming sensory information. Remember, the brain operates by receiving incoming sensory information, then it processes it, and then it puts out motor commands to excitatory tissue. So all of the incoming sensory information coming into your brain first goes to the thalamus. That is everything except for olfactory sensory information. It gets processed, and then it gets sent on to other different areas within the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, which is, I'm going to highlight it and then move right in there, the hypothalamus, acts as a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It releases quite a few hormones that can act on this organ here, the pituitary. So you see the pituitary gland is immediately below where the hypothalamus is, and the hypothalamus releases hormones that can act on the pituitary gland or can enter into the pituitary gland. So that's a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And the epithalamus acts in several ways, including secretion of hormones, and also there's an area close by where you get production of cerebral spinal fluid. So to get back in a little bit more detail about the thalamus, you have pairs of egg-shaped collections of cell bodies or masses that form the upper wall of the third ventricle. So you have several nuclei. That's a collection of ganglion, or cell bodies rather. that receive sensory input. The main function, again, of the thalamus is to act as a central hub or relay station for sensory information coming in. So all sensory information will converge and make connections or synapses in the thalamus, and they get sorted out and relayed onward. Anything coming in from the cerebral cortex will also pass through the thalamus. So it plays a key role in mediating sensations and motor activities and arousal level of the cerebral cortex, cortical arousal, in other words, learning and memory, a lot of very important functions. The hypothalamus, as I said, is mostly involved in releasing, well, it has two separate kind of areas of importance. One is, as I said earlier, releasing hormones that will act on the pituitary gland, which is just beneath it. But it also regulates quite a few very important functions, including blood pressure. It's not the only regulatory center for blood pressure, but it does regulate blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, rate and depth of breathing. It is involved in all of these fundamental functions, including digestive tract motility. So it is has quite an important role. It's also involved in pleasure, rage, fear. It helps maintain body temperature. If you're going to get a spike in fever, an increase in body temperature, it will be because of signals that the hypothalamus has received from other areas of the body. Regulates hunger and feeling of fullness, or actually can't pronounce this word, satiety. And when you're satiated, that means you're full. You feel full, you're no longer hungry. And regulates sleep and the sleep cycle. Quite a few important roles. Plus, an endocrine function, in which it produces releasing hormones that will act on the anterior lobe. The pituitary gland has two lobes, an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And we'll get more into this when we do the endocrine system. But the anterior lobe of the pituitary is affected by these releasing hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. In addition, the hypothalamus will release two key hormones called ADH, which, as you should know, is antidiuretic hormone. We covered that in renal physiology. Antidiuretic hormone, which prevents release of or loss of fluid in the urine. So it's antidiuresis action, has an antidiuretic action. And oxytocin, another hormone, and I won't get into that now, but we will talk about it later in endocrine or reproductive physiology. These two hormones are are synthesized in the hypothalamus and then secreted into the posterior lobe of the pituitary, where they're stored until they need to be released. So the hypothalamus is has quite an important endocrine function, and also very important regulatory function, as I said in the previous slide, on a number of physiological systems. Okay, the third part of the diencephalon is the epithalamus. It's forms the roof of the third ventricle, that fluid-filled space. It contains the pineal gland, which is involved in production of melatonin, and the function of this hormone is involved in sleep regulation, sleep-wake cycles, and mood. There is also some choroid plexus tissue there. The choroid plexus is what synthesizes and secretes cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so let's move on to the brainstem. This is the most almost primitive, basic, most structure within the central nervous system. It has three major regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which most people refer to just as the medulla. Similar in many ways to the spinal cord, but contains, in addition, some embedded nuclei. Remember, these are collections of cell bodies, neuronal cell bodies. It controls automatic behaviors that are absolutely necessary for survival, some of the most basic ones, including cardiac function and respiration. It's also, there's tracts, nerve tracts, axons that run through between higher and low. It's a pathway through which these tracts run between the higher and lower brain centers. And it is associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come into and out of the brain, and 10 of them are associated with the brainstem. So here you see in the diagram the brainstem in this entire area here in, I'll change colors just a second, this area here, which is all of this here. This is all brainstem. All of this in green. And the three parts, the pons, medulla, and midbrain. So all of that green labeled material. This is a different view of the brainstem. This is an anterior view and much enlarged. And you see that these are paired structures. The midbrain, pons, and medulla are on either side here of this central area. There's some choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle. Remember, the third ventricle is up in this area here. And the fourth ventricle is here. So there's more choroid plexus tissue, which is forming cerebral spinal fluid. You have the, in this area here, actually the third ventricle is all through here in this area. So you have the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the green tissue. The midbrain is important in as a relay area for information, sensory information from vision and hearing. It's also involved in motor control, sleep, wakefulness, alert. I wouldn't memorize all of these things. They can be quite confusing because several areas within the brain are also important, but the main things I would say is that the brainstem in general, you should always realize is important as a relay station for information coming in and going out down the spinal cord, and also is important in controlling cardiac and respiratory function. But there are several other things that it does. As I said, the pons part of the midbrain is, as we've learned previously when we did respiration, is involved in control of respiration and also sending signals up and down to the other areas of the brain, relaying air, between different parts of the brain and down to the spinal cord, and also sensory information up to the thalamus. So it's quite an important relay station. And then we get to the medulla, which is, contains the cardiovascular control center and the respiratory control center. These are the major areas of determining force and rate of heart contraction and rate and depth of breathing. A person who has no measurable cerebrum, it's not measurable cerebrum, but measurable cerebral activity. They do not have any cerebral activity. are considered to be brain dead and therefore dead. They can be declared dead. And they will be unconscious, completely unconscious, but they will still have a beating heart, and they will still breathe because the medulla is still operating, or the brainstem, the pons and medulla are still operating, but they are legally dead, and that's the kind of status which is that's the kind of cadaver status that's used for organ donors often. Okay, now we move on to the cerebellum, which is in this area that is encircled here. The cerebellum is dorsal, more posterior or dorsal to the pons and medulla. It is immediately below the visual cortex, which is found, I have to change color, which is in this region here of the occipital lobe. So it's immediately beneath the occipital lobe, or occipital lobes of the cerebrum. The cerebellum forms about 10-11% of the brain mass. It is involved in timing and pattern, the pattern of skeletal muscle contraction. You know, if you reach out, for example, to grab something and pick it up and then bring it back towards you, you are using many different skeletal muscles, and they have to be precisely timed in an appropriate sequence in order for that to be successful. And that's the function of the cerebellum, which is entirely subconscious. It's not something that you're aware that you're doing, but it is an extremely important function. Okay, the cerebellum itself also contains a homunculus. In fact, there are two homunculi. This is a anterior view. The midline is here, so the two parts are two symmetrical hemispheres of the cerebellum. There's one there, and there's the other one there. Those two are connected by a structure called the vermis. And you have these two homunculi within those hemispheres. The other characteristic feature of the cerebellum is that if you look at a midline cross section through it, which is shown here in this diagram, the lower diagram, and this area here is the cerebellum. If you look at that, then what you see is a particular pattern of gray matter and white matter. Remember, gray matter contains the neuron cell bodies, and white matter are the axons that are projecting from those neurons. And the key characteristic pattern is that the white matter, the cerebellar white matter, has a tree-like appearance, and that tree-like pattern is called the arbor vitae. Arbor vitae is Latin for the tree of life. So here you see the cerebellum and this tree-like structure throughout. Here, all of these projections look like the branches of a tree, and that's why it was called the arbor vitae. Okay, so that's all the white matter within the cerebellum. In terms of the brain protection, the brain has several structures that help protect it. and they include the bones of the skull, as well as the three very tough connective tissue membranes that are called meninges. And I'll go through each of those three in the next slide, as well as the cushioning function of the cerebral spinal fluid. Every space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and that acts to cushion any rapid movement so you don't have the brain banging against the wall of the skull. Although with a violent enough motion, you can get the brain actually impacting on the skull, but the CSF tends to prevent that and dampen that. The brain also, in addition, and I'll talk about a little bit about this later, is also shielded by what's called the blood-brain barrier. If you recall, we talked about that just a little bit, I think, when we talked about the capillaries, that in some areas of the body, the capillaries are particularly, the endothelial cells that line the capillaries, the blood vessel capillaries, are particularly tight, and that's what makes the blood-brain barrier in brain tissue. Okay, so those meninges that I talked about, the connective tissue membranes, they're three of them, and they are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. And they are under the skull and external to the central nervous system. They help protect it, cover it. They'll enclose blood vessels. They hold in the cerebral spinal fluid and will form partitions within the skull. You can see that in this next diagram. The outermost meninge is the dura mater. Underneath that is the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. So you have these layers here, one after another, with the last one, the pia mater, lying right on top of the brain tissue. And you can see it follows, if you look here, I'll just outline it. It's following exactly the surface of the cerebral cortex, okay, in this part of the diagram at least. The other structure, of course, is the bone, which is exterior to that. And as I said earlier, the cerebral spinal fluid also helps to protect the brain. It's significant protective contribution. The cerebral spinal fluid is produced by tissue that lines ventricles. That tissue is called the choroid plexus. It's shown here in red. There's several areas actually where there is choroid plexus, but the main ones are in the wall of the third ventricle here in the brain, and also in the fourth ventricle near the cerebellum. The fluid of the cerebral, the liquid that's makes up the cerebral spinal fluid is very similar in many ways to blood plasma. It forms a cushioning protective mechanism to protect the central nervous system, and also helps nourish the brain and carry some chemical signals through the brain. So that's the protective mechanisms that the brain has structurally or physically in terms of the CSF, but also it has this structure that I mentioned is quite important in the capillaries, which is the blood-brain barrier. What you have is a mechanism that helps to maintain a particularly stable environment. You know, the rest of your excuse me, the vasculature contains the blood, and the blood plasma changes in its characteristics quite a bit depending upon what you're taking in terms of food or what your metabolism is like. And the brain needs to be protected from those rapid changes in molecules in the it has to be protected from that. Shouldn't be exposed to those, and particularly has to be protected also if, in case any bacteria should get or microorganisms should get into the bloodstream. So you have a continuous, very tight endothelial cells lining the capillary walls of the capillaries that are within the brain, with a relatively thick basement membrane or basal lamina. There are also these cells that are surrounding it. These cells are found within the brain, and they will surround the capillaries. The cells are called astrocytes. They also contribute to this blood-brain barrier. So it'll separate any substances, keep them separate from the neurons, not allow them through. It does allow through nutrients. It does allow for gases to diffuse easily across, but it will protect the brain from a number of things. There are certain areas within the around the third and fourth ventricle. Remember the spaces that contain CSF? There are certain areas that don't have this blood-brain barrier, so that they do get exposed to what's going on in the, what's present in the plasma. And not surprisingly, this is actually in areas that include the vomiting center. So if they detect something that is nauseous or toxic, that part of the brain will trigger vomiting, which is good. And also it allows the hypothalamus and pineal glands to monitor conditions of the plasma and also secrete hormones into it. So these areas of the brain that are listed here where there's a lack of blood-brain barrier, they help to monitor the chemical composition of the blood plasma. Okay, now in the next 3 slides, I'm covering a huge area. These are huge topics, so I can't really do them even the most basic justice of the amount of detail that and things that are known about these topics, but at least you'll have some exposure to the topic. In terms of degenerative brain disorders, there are 3 major ones that are quite important. There's Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive kind of breakdown of the brain tissue, and it ends up resulting in dementia. There's also Parkinson's disease, which is degeneration of a particular area in the brain, what's called the substantia nigra. And then there's Hunting disease, which is a genetic hereditary disorder resulting in accumulation of a protein that again leads to degeneration, in this case of the basal nuclei in the cerebrum. So remember those areas that are deeper in the cerebrum that are accumulations of neuron cell bodies. These are quite awful diseases that are very active areas of research. There's also epilepsy. Now, epilepsy occurs in approximately 1% of the population. That's a lot of people. And seizures cause the individual, if they have a seizure, they'll lose consciousness. They can fall very stiffly. They'll have very stiff kind of muscle contraction, uncontrollable jerking motions. They have they're seizing. It's can be controlled by medication. It has no effect whatsoever on the thinking or cognitive ability of the individual. And the last big topic are cerebral vascular accidents, strokes. In this case, due to a blockage of the blood circulation, or sometimes a rupture of a blood vessel, you get inadequate blood circulation to a particular part of the brain. It can be in almost any part of the brain it could occur, and the brain tissue in that area dies. Most common cause is by blockage due to an embolus entering into the one of the cerebral arteries, and but you can also get strokes due to compression by bleeding, hemorrhage, or swelling, edema, and also due to atherosclerosis. Some people, often people who are older, will start getting transient ischemic attacks. So it's a transient or temporary ischemia, which is a lack of adequate levels of oxygen. They'll get transient ischemic attacks in different parts of the brain. These are reversible because they're so temporary, but it's not a particularly good sign. Okay. So the other major part of the central nervous system, besides the brain, we've finished covering an introduction or basic information about each part of the brain, but the other major part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. It's enclosed within the vertebra or the bones of the vertebral column from the foramen magnum, which is this opening here through which nerve tissue goes up into the brain, which is roughly at this level here, and it's shown here also. I put in a line here to show you right there. Sorry, the line is right there. Okay. So from there, from the foramen magnum, this hole that's at the base of the skull, down to lumbar vertebra 1 or L1. So from up here all the way down you find spinal cord tissue, and this is what allows further below that it's all mostly white matter, I guess. This spinal cord allows for two-way communication both towards and from the brain, and is well protected by bone and meninges and CSF, just like the brain itself is. The structure, when you take a cross section through the spinal cord, this is on this side, that's the dorsal side. This bone here is the projections that you feel along a person's back, midline. This is the vertebrae here. This round structure is the vertebrae, and enclosed between those two bones, the bone, so the vertebrae and the vertebrae, it's the body of the vertebrae, you have the spinal cord. And we'll talk quite a bit about that spinal cord and signals going in and out of it in the next video, or lecture video, which is Unit 3, Part 3. So I think I'm going to stop there. I just wanted to remind you again that in this view we have on this side we have the dorsal side, which is the posterior, and here is the ventral side of the anterior. So the front of the body is down here and the back is there, dorsal or ventral side, anterior, dorsal or posterior side, and ventral or anterior side down here. And what you're seeing here are the spinal nerves that run in and out towards the spinal cord. Okay, and we'll get into that a bit more certainly more in the the next video lecture. So I think we'll stop there.